Welcome to the Time to Hire podcast.
I'm Jake Paul.
And I'm Will Ducey. Our goal with this podcast is to bring in new perspectives and ensure the recruiting function remains relevant and forward-looking.
We talk to recruiting experts, HR tech founders, and anyone who brings unconventional ideas to help push the craft of recruiting forward.
If you want to future-proof yourself and increase your impact over time through strategy, technology, and best practices, this is the podcast for you. It is time to hire.
Well, let's just dive right in. Maybe you could start off and just share with everyone a quick overview of your background and sort of career journey to date.
Sure. I have been in the HR and recruiting space for about 15 years now. I started on the agency side of the business deep at the start of the Great Recession in 2008. I spent about 4 years on the agency side, both in Orange County and Chicago, specializing in recruiting for software engineers. And then moved on to the consulting side. So I had sort of this question in my mind of what was going to be the difference between being in an agency and going in-house. And I came across an opportunity at Brody Consulting, a HR and recruiting consulting firm in San Francisco. And it ended up being this perfect bridge between those two paths. It was a great opportunity for me, especially moving to San Francisco for the first time. And so it was almost like being in startup school. We embedded ourselves into various startups throughout the Bay Area. Recruited for a number of really interesting clients. Grew the early team at Gusto back when they were Zen Payroll at the time. Places like Boku, Medallia. Eventually ended up consulting to Crunchbase. So I spent about 3.5 years there. And ended up loving one of my clients so much that I ended up getting an opportunity to join full-time as their director of people and talent. And so I joined them in 2016, and it was really my first foray into the HR space in addition to owning recruiting as well. And so they had just spun out from TechCrunch at the time. So I was really tasked with this opportunity of how you build and grow this entirely new culture and build an entirely new team that was more modernized for this new phase of the business. And so spent about 3 years there, grew the team from about 10 employees to about 100, implemented all of the HR and recruiting infrastructure for the first time. And then 3 years on, I was ready for the next opportunity. The really big question was, okay, now I've grown a company to 100. How do I then grow to a company to 500 or 1,000? Or what is that next step in my career? And so I had given notice, was actively interviewing at the time, and frankly, life threw me some curveballs. I found out about a week before my last day at Crunchbase that my dad had terminal cancer, and it threw a big wrench in the process. And so I was in the late stages of deciding what to do next. Ultimately, ended up accepting a job as head of recruiting at a Series C company. Unfortunately, my dad passed really quickly. And so I ended up starting this new job about a month after he passed. And within a couple of days of joining, I knew I was in the wrong place. Ended up quitting within 2 months. And I tell this story because it really set the stage for what ultimately became my business today. I founded a company called Brody Consulting Group about 4.5 years ago. By accident. Had no dreams or intentions of ever being an entrepreneur or a founder. And this really became sort of a reminder of what I loved about recruiting and of what I loved about HR so much. So, when I left this Series C company, one of the big learnings that I had was the later the company is, the less willing they are to actually change processes. And frankly, the best time to actually learn good behaviors is in the early days of the company. And so joining this 150-person Series C company made me realize, gosh, I loved being at a place like Crunchbase where I could build this from scratch and teach people how to do things the right way, because you are setting yourself up for success. You're attracting better people. You're supporting your existing team, and the work that you're putting into actually building the team comes to fruition, and you see that being beneficial. And so what started as kind of a consulting gig to get myself on my feet and allow for sort of mental space in my life after my dad passed away ended up becoming a successful business, 4.5 years on.
I'm curious, going back to the earlier stage of your career, what prompted the shift in interest sort of away from the agency world? Because actually both Will and I, we started in that world. Some love it and are there for their whole careers. Yeah. Will and I are in the other camp where I think we both didn't love it and sort of aspired to get in-house. Was it clear that you wanted to go in-house, or, it sounded like you wanted to explore a little bit before making that leap, which you did at Crunchbase, but what was your take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I also fall into the camp that you're in of wanting to do something else. At the time, I don't think I understood really what I wanted to do next. I knew I didn't want to be an agency, but I don't know your experiences on the agency side of the house, but you're in the grinder. It is a constant job, especially starting out in the recession where, I'm calling insurance and title and real estate tech companies trying to convince them that they should hire my engineers when they just laid off thousands of employees. And, there's a major real estate and financial crisis. And I knew that sort of grit that got me through that time was not necessarily how I wanted to continue my career moving forward. But I had this fear of what was it like to go in-house. I always found that there was some benefit to being a third party, that there was sort of an assumed level of expertise that you can give someone more of the 50,000 foot view rather than being so embedded and deep into what's happening in the business that perhaps maybe you have blinders on. And so I think that's why going into consulting ended up not really realizing that that was something that was an opportunity for me or an option, but that sort of bridged that gap. So my fear of being maybe not looked at as, deep expertise in this, or not being able to see beyond what's right in front of me, ended up being this really great transition. So unknowingly, each sort of phase of my career ended up being sort of a stepping stone and a kind of next step to what I ultimately am doing now.
Yeah, I think, like I said, Will and I share the same sentiment. I think I was in-house for about 4 years, and from my perspective, I just saw these cool companies that we were placing people at, and I felt like this weird middleman, and I just wanted to go actually work for one of those companies.
Yeah.
And so that was my sort of exodus. And in addition to being fairly mediocre at my agency recruiting efforts, and Will always likes to say that I actually saved him from the agency world, because when I was at ThoughtWorks, it was time to go hire a new person, and I was like, look, agencies is an incredible place to cut your teeth in recruiting and really learn the grit and that sense of urgency and just, generally some good practices. And I was like, I want to go find somebody who has 2 years of experience in the agency world, but wants out. And I literally hit up Will on LinkedIn, and he was off to the races and joined our team. And that's how we got to know each other. But
yeah, I think that's it. Frankly, that's I wouldn't call it a requirement for when I grow my team, but I think to me it has been indicative. It is one kind of piece of what it can ultimately make a company or make a person more successful, is seeing that they've been sort of through the trenches. They know what it's like to be in such a high pressure environment, to know that your salary is dependent upon you filling roles. I think our business is very much in contrast with that, but I think it has taught a lot of really good behaviors. And I'm personally grateful to have that experience, while I probably wouldn't have said that at the time.
Okay, Jessica, let's jump into Brody Consulting Group. Tell us a little bit more about the engagements you work on, the companies you work with, anything you want to share there.
Sure. Brody Consulting Group is a fully bespoke people and talent consulting firm. So what that means is we have an embedded model designed to partner directly with early stage companies. So we specialize in anything from the pre-seed through Series C stage. And our goal is to run a simultaneous parallel path. We understand that a lot of early stage companies lack the infrastructure and processes and tooling to set themselves up to be successful when it comes to hiring or even supporting their team members long term. So we run the path of working with them to set up infrastructure. So things like your ATS, interview training, teaching folks actually how to give feedback in places like Greenhouse or Ashby or Lever. We're scoping out the roles. We're utilizing tools like Gem to run email campaigns. And then the other piece of that is we work to fill the jobs for you. And so we want to make sure that the effort that you're putting into filling those jobs and spending time interviewing candidates is going to come out in the wash, and that you're eventually going to be able to hire because you're set up to be successful. We've been around for 4.5 years, as I've mentioned. Our team is built of seasoned startup operators. We've recruited for places like, Fitbit, Instacart, One Medical, Crunchbase here, Netflix, and we've seen it all. We've experienced it all. And so we want to lend our expertise to companies who are in similar positions as places that we've encountered in the past.
So that's a wide range of companies from pre-seed to One Medical and much larger later stage. How would you break down the bulk of the work that you do between the larger companies with an existing recruiting team versus presumably where you come in as pre-recruiter?
Great question. So our team is made up of folks who have worked at those places. So I mentioned One Medical. So we have folks on our team that have worked at One Medical. In terms of the folks that we work with, there's a pretty wide variety. I would say in the range of 60% of the work, we are the first in-house for either the people or the talent function. And so we are teaching them for the first time, and maybe they've gotten their first round of funding, and so they have a handful of roles that they need to fill now, and they've never hired for more than one person at a time. We have worked with folks at mid-stage, so Series C companies where we're the second, third, or fourth recruiter on the team. So we're adding bandwidth to their existing function. Oftentimes, companies will hire maybe one expertise, so they have someone who is an expert on the non-technical side, but they need folks who are going to come in and actually fill these highly technical roles, or vice versa. Or we can come in a situation where we're a sort of a fractional head of talent. So we're actually running the team that exists today. But we see a pretty wide variety, I would say. And the bespoke model really lends itself to the differences that we see in companies. So we have companies who need everything. So they say, help us with everything you can. Others say, just help us. We have 10 roles we need to fill. Let's execute on those.
As you said, you started this sort of as a sort of what sounded like an interim gig to kind of figure out what you're going to next. And now all of a sudden you're a real proper company with employees. When did you know that it was time to hire your first person, and how was that?
Great question. I would say, I started the business in the summer of 2019. And for the first couple of months, I thought, okay, this is just, a consulting gig for me. I assumed that I would go in within the first 6 months or so, or first year, and be able to properly evaluate a company by consulting to them. And eventually I would transition to a head of recruiting role or head of people role. And so
Got it.
Within a couple months, I realized, oh, wow, there's a need for exactly what I'm doing in the market. There's plenty of agencies out there. Frankly, there's plenty of consultants, but very few that are actually specialized in the early stage. And so I wanted to take my expertise in this domain and really lend that expertise to other companies. And so by the fall is when I realized that it was a real company. By January of 2020 is when I realized it was definitely time to start hiring employees. We couldn't keep up with the demand. To this day, we have acquired all of our business through referrals or folks that we know in our network. And so 2020 was when I hired a consultant for the first time, as we all know what happens next.
Yep.
Come April, the clients that we were working with all dropped. We had this moment of, what the heck, is the world going to end? And I know I was not the only one that had it. Jake, as we know, we were all part of this talent collective that was freaking out.
Yep.
And fortunately, within 3 weeks of getting dropped by all the clients, they all brought us back. And we had a handful of clients that were looking to go full time and really wanted a lot of support. And I would say over the next couple of months after that it felt like we were off to the races again. And so that's when I could think about hiring more folks onto the team. And so it's been a really great journey so far.
Jessica, tell us a little bit more about how you pitch your company. You said you have a very solid referral network, but how does Brody Consulting compare to other boutique staffing firms, or sorry, not staffing firms, but other firms in this space?
I would say probably 50% of the time we find ourselves coming up against potentially another firm in winning the business. And we have yet to find a company that does exactly what we do. There are certainly different niches within the recruiting agency and recruiting firm space. So the most obvious one that many know and we've experienced is the contingency side of the house. That is not uncommon that we come up against some of those firms. We've come across certainly fractional heads of talent or fractional heads of people in some of these opportunities, but usually I think the big way that we separate ourselves is that we have this embedded model with deep expertise in early stage. The folks that we come up against are have more of, I would say, a broad coverage of different types and sizes of businesses. Whereas I want us to be known as the place that knows early stage like the back of our hands. I think the problems that early stage companies come across or challenges are no different than what you're going to see at any other early stage company. There'll be slight nuances there. And so I want to show that we are the folks who have repeatable experience, that the problems and challenges that you are facing are things that we've seen before, and we are equipped to help you get there. The other piece of that too is that expertise really lends us that the clout on the data side of the house. We are obsessed with data and being able to demonstrate our value to companies. And so one of the ways that we do that is really being able to compare and contrast how email campaigns when we're recruiting are comparing to our other clients. And so if we're working on a full stack engineering role at one Series A company and another at a Series B or a seed stage company, we can directly say, hey, we know exactly what the response rate should look like. We know what your interested rates should look like. We know what they should look like when you are in stealth mode versus what they should be looking like if you are in more of a public awareness. And so being able to demonstrate that to our clients and say, we're not in a good space. We need to improve this, or let's modify, let's iterate this, I think has become really beneficial. And frankly, I would say our expertise and our experience. I have 15 years of experience working for some of the best companies in Silicon Valley. My team has been there as well and sort of seen it all. And so I think when you look at the roster of our team and seeing the companies that we've helped grow, it becomes kind of a no-brainer for the folks that we're chatting with.
What are you seeing in the market today, right? We've seen a lot of fluctuations. Engineering hiring has always been challenging, but what's your take on where things stand today from a hiring perspective, from a candidate availability perspective?
It's changed a lot. I would say every 3 months we're seeing some significant changes. So obviously at the start of the year, it was heavily focused on folks that were getting let go. There was an influx in folks getting let go from the big tech companies. And so all of a sudden you're seeing an influx of people from Google and Meta and Apple and Netflix flooding the market. And there was, I think, this instant reaction from a lot of early stage companies like, oh my gosh, let's get him. This is the first time we're going to have an opportunity to hire a Google engineer. And I think a lot of companies really spun their wheels on a lot of these candidates, thinking that there was an opportunity to attract them. And I think a couple things happened. I think very, very quickly, companies were starting to realize it was perhaps not a good use of time for early stage companies to really go after these public company folks for a number of reasons. I think one being expertise, in that oftentimes big company folks own more of a small piece of the puzzle, whereas the folks that we look for in startups have coverage over quite a bit. So a traditional engineer may even touch a little bit of product or even touch a little bit of design at a startup. So I think that was one piece. The other piece is on the compensation side. I think with low interest rates leading up to 2023, a lot of people got into situations where they purchased homes, or coming out of COVID, they started to build families all of a sudden. And so they were locked into these really precarious financial positions that the only really opportunity for them to continue with that same sort of standard of living was to go to another public company or go to a late stage company that was able to offer them more cash. And so I think that's how the year started. Moving into the summer, it felt like it started to normalize a bit. One of the things that my team has been noticing as the fall has started and now we're moving into winter is that competition has massively increased. We're seeing that a lot of our candidates are getting back to the stage of many, many offers, whereas earlier this year, maybe they only had one or two, or they were very selectively looking at opportunities if they were in a place where they were comfortable leaving their jobs proactively, certainly not by layoffs. And so we're seeing that our companies are really having to pull out all the stops to sell throughout the process. And so we're spending a lot of time guiding our clients around selling starts from the very minute. You can't assume that anyone you're talking to is actually really excited about working for you. And so spend the time thinking about what your pitch is, why people should work there, and make sure that you're investing in the right people. These people are likely going to be there for a few years. And so, go through the homework, but it's time to get ready and, maybe brace yourselves for the times of the past.
I didn't think I'd be hearing that so soon. But it's what you're describing certainly sounds like the starting point of getting back to the good old days. But we'll see how this evolves.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I question whether we're ever going to get properly back to the good old days. I think there are signs that there's an inclination to do so. I think there's also, some people have some battle scars over what's happened over the past year and a half or so. Whether folks got laid off, whether, things were, a little more bootstrapped than they would like, and funding was less accessible. And so I, while I certainly wouldn't, would like to repeat what's happened over the past year, I think it taught a lot of companies, our company included, to really batten down the hatches and really focus on what's important and to reduce burn. And, I think it also gave an opportunity where a time was VCs were giving funding to everyone. And this sort of narrowed it a little bit. And the companies that are getting money and the companies that are succeeding are the ones that were set up better for success.
Jessica, talk to us a little bit about the dynamic between operating as a consultant versus internally as a head of talent, and that dynamic, establishing trust with the leadership team and what that process looks like.
I think given our expertise, we often come in with sort of an assumed level of trust. And oftentimes, given that we are referred by whether it be their investors or someone that they trust in their network. And so it allows us this opportunity. But I'm very quick to share with my clients that this is always a safe space. This is always a confidential space. And I think also humanizing the experience for people, that this is not something, this problem or challenge you're facing right now is not unique to you. And so I've seen it all. And so I think just really calming folks down that if there are challenges, that it's going to be okay. It's not unique. And I think it's hard because you often have blinders on. But I think it's also very quickly we can see, when we give guidance and feedback, the one thing that I tell my clients is, listen, I'm going to give you the feedback. You may like it, you may not. You can take with it what you like. You can implement everything I say. You can choose not to. I'm going to tell you what I think is the best way to set yourself up for success. I can tell you what potentially could happen if you don't do those things. But I always want to be in a position where I'm telling them exactly what I feel. And I think if I establish that early on, I think it's made for a very trusting relationship. And we often see our clients, even, they hire those first handful of people and they're not hiring for a period of time. I'll get a call, a year or 2 years later saying, we'd love for you to come back. We have another handful of roles, or, hey, I need help building up performance reviews. I think just leveling the playing field and just making it a safe space for someone is what's really helped me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that had not really occurred to me, as far as like the comfort that you're able to provide to them, not just as an expert going in, but having somebody who is able to, in the moment, see across the spectrum of what's happening in the market, right? When you're an early stage startup, whether you're the founder or the head of talent, like you're in a bubble, and and it's like, I don't know, what should my time to hire be, or what should my response rates be for a company my stage. So that must be pretty advantageous for you to be able to have that purview, I guess, coming in at sort of a leadership level.
Yeah.
And I guess to the sort of onto the point about the trust initially getting established. What about expectation setting? So I know for me, I've been head of talent, which as the first boots on the ground, 30 people, first recruiter, you get in there and they, at least in my perspective, have been perceived as, oh, here comes the silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. Yeah. Look, we made 30 hires without a single recruiter. Now imagine what we can do as we have a full-time person solely focused on this. So there's a little bit of a expectation setting craft out there. And I'm curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, I've certainly learned this lesson the hard way from my in-house days. I think we've all been there. And I think, one of the big challenges of the first in-house role is you're often getting tasked with a lot. They may hand you 20 roles, as they did with me. It was, 20 roles plus you also own people. And so, but you're one person and you have no one there supporting you. And so I think there's an inclination to say that you can deliver things very, very quickly. However, the experience that I've learned is, how much time does it actually take to fill a role? From the time that you scope out the position to the first reach out to a candidate, and you think about all the steps that exist in the process that frankly just take time, no matter if you have the fastest and quickest interview process or you take a long time, there's a certain need for time. So you send an email campaign with a three email sequence. Well, that email sequence isn't going to complete for a week and a half to 2 weeks. We're going to see a steady, flow of candidates coming in throughout that. And so one of the important things that I started doing in the very early days of starting my business is setting the expectation of how long it's going to take to fill a role. And so I tell clients it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks to generate an offer because there are so many steps that come in. And setting that and telling them what is going to happen by week, I think has been one of the most beneficial points because they know what to expect. They know when it feels a little quiet for the first week, it's because we're in the process of identifying the candidates we want to contact and drafting those email templates. It's actually reaching out to those candidates. And so if they know what's happening behind the scenes, and even telling them things like, hey, we got our first candidate interested. My first phone call is coming up in 3 days. Letting them know that stuff is happening still behind the scenes, I think has been really useful to our clients because historically in the agency world, in my previous consulting days, it was always like, what's happening? Where is this? And if you don't share that data ahead of time, there's always going to be a question coming to you of what's actually happening behind the scenes because most people don't know how the sausage is made in recruiting. And so it's tough.
Secret sauce is definitely transparency and data and using that to your advantage, which, historically is not something that many recruiting teams have been equipped with. But fortunately now through new tools and platforms, it's much more readily available, which is super valuable.
Absolutely. I didn't learn any of this in my agency or previous consulting days. And so I learned this lesson, I would say the hard way when I was at Crunchbase of realizing how am I going to demonstrate what we're doing and what we're generating. And so now that has become a fundamental component of our business of being able to demonstrate this to our clients.
Jessica, that clear expectation setting is so crucial. You've done a great job of that, obviously, with your clients. The 30, 60, 90 days when you're starting with a new client are super important. Is there a specific playbook that you've sort of developed over the last 4.5 years where you know exactly what you need to do when you join a company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say if you're joining for the first time as a first in-house recruiter or first head of talent or first head of people is talk to everyone, especially if you can at an early stage company and there's a smaller number of people. Go in with your ears open, take notes, make sure you're listening, absorb as much information as possible. I think there's always this inclination to go in and solve every major challenge immediately. I think you should plan to make one change very, very quickly. Make it something that is lower consequence, but shows that you have an opinion. Come in with an opinion on how to actually do these things, but evaluate, audit everything, look to see what tooling exists, how they're managing the recruiting process, how their HR infrastructure is built, what is the general sentiment from the employees of the company. And those will help you to actually establish how to move forward. I think there's only so much you can learn in an interview process that a company will share with you. I'm a firm believer that every company has skeletons. It's just a matter of when they're going to open that closet to you, if they're going to open it at all, and if they're willing to make any of those changes to clean things up. Every company will have them, whether they're inconsequential or consequential.
You may have just answered my next question, which is going to be about a lot of these problems as you go into these early stage companies are pretty much the same, but with different flavors. What do you see as being the biggest variability across these sort of early stage companies that you go into, your clients? Sounds like what skeletons are in their closet is one of those variables, but how would you talk to that?
I would say the most common is that there is a lack of a singular interview process. I think there is an instinct to patch something very quickly and easily together. So that could be, hey, we're hiring for a head of marketing, and everyone just picks something that they want to cover without understanding if there's any overlap whatsoever in any of the interview topics that are covered, whether the questions that are being answered are going to net them a signal of whether they're a good fit or not, whether there's any calibration whatsoever on what level you're looking for or what you're actually expecting of this person to do. And so I think that is the biggest challenge. And so I think if there is a willingness to be able to solidify and make a singular process that is observed every single time you interview a candidate, from your first interaction with them to what it's like for them to onboard, then I think you're halfway there. On the HR side of the house, I think it's companies often forget when they're recruiting that you also need to support candidates once they become employees and work there over the course of time. And so, especially in the early days, it's often someone who's a CFO, it's maybe the CEO who is managing the HR side of the house and therefore neglecting it. It's an incredibly crucial thing that they know needs to exist, but they're not necessarily willing to put the time into it, frankly, because it's a secondary responsibility for them. And so one of the big things that we do is really equip them with what are the things that you should be thinking about at this stage. So that's the other piece, is most companies are just really lacking any HR infrastructure until they feel like, oh my gosh, something bad happens and they need it all of a sudden.
Yeah, usually about 70 employees when something goes sideways is when they're like, we should probably have had this a year ago.
Yeah, and they've already missed the key 50 employee mark on a number of compliance issues there. So
yeah,
it's much easier to do and roll out when you have a smaller number of people at the company. It makes it so much simpler.
And so are you guys offering support on the HR side as well, setting up their systems and processes?
Absolutely. So we offer a full service approach on both the people and talent side. A big chunk of our business is the recruiting side of the house, because that becomes the most crucial piece for early stage companies when their VCs are like, you got the money, let's go, build the product, you need the people. And so we offer everything from interim head of people to interim HR managers. We'll evaluate different systems for you to use. We certainly have systems that we recommend, but it will be bespoke, but depending on what that company is needing at the time. And everything from performance reviews to engagement to diversity and inclusion, even comp and leveling. And frankly, on the unfortunate side, over the last couple of years, we've handled reductions in force and layoffs. And so, what is your comm strategy? How are you making sure you're being compliant? And especially now that we're in the days of folks working on many different states across the US, working in different countries throughout the world. Maybe they're on a different remote work platform than your typical HRIS. How do we make sure that we're staying compliant and making sure that we're supporting the folks getting let go as much as humanly possible?
Jessica, you've been through multiple business cycles. This is the year of reduced teams, doing more with less, new tools entering the market. Putting your forecasting hat on, what do you think may fundamentally change about the role of a recruiter over the next 2 to 3 years?
I think the role is becoming more invaluable than ever. I think there's always this question, and frankly, as long as I've been in recruiting, there's been this question of whether technology will replace recruiters. And especially now with AI coming out, is that going to replace the role of the recruiter? And frankly, I think there are certainly some benefits that AI can bring to the recruiting sphere and to the people sphere. It is never going to replace the role of the human. There are so many elements. If you think about, if you're recruiting for, let's call it a software engineer, to just be really simple, sure, AI can determine whether that person has the correct buzzwords on a resume or on a LinkedIn profile. But what's missing is that human element to understand what it is specifically they do. What are they looking for in their next job? What gets them excited? Are they interested in this position? How do you market the opportunity with the company? And really connecting with them and meeting the employees where they're at. I mean, one of the big reasons I got into recruiting is no one goes to college and says, I want to be a recruiter when I grow up, is I knew I really liked talking to people and I was a really good matchmaker. I loved setting up my friends, both romantically, and I loved connecting different friend groups and different people. And so I think of that matchmaking element is one of the most important pieces. The big reason we operate on sort of an hourly model as opposed to contingency is I want to be motivated for the right reasons. I want to be able to identify someone who's going to be an addition to your culture and who represents the values that your company holds dear. And I don't think AI is ever really going to be able to do that. And so I think with these tools, there's greater access to potentially discovering candidates. But moving forward, I think the human is going to be the most crucial piece to be able to separate what AI is telling you and, what is actually a good fit for the company long term.
Yeah, and at a minimum, somebody's got to manage the AI. So I think the role
Yeah.
could evolve to be there as that human touch, but at the end of the day, somebody's Celeste to manage all the systems. So
Yeah,
I could
exactly
see it
right.
being evolving to a bit of a project management role more than just getting eliminated overall, which, as you said, is not going to happen.
Jessica, as we come to the end of our time together, what's something that you wished Jake or I would have asked you?
Oh, good question.
Good interview question.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I would love to cover is, how recruiters coming up can think about how to develop their career paths. There are so many different options and so many different avenues that you can go down when you're a recruiter. Frankly, I've been down several of those avenues. I've found the one that works for me. That's not going to be the same case for everyone else. But I think there is a tendency to want to take the shortcut and go the easier route and not put in the time and the work to get to where you are. Uh, you know, the times are very different than when I came up and finished school. And, 2008 is, I was making $30,000 a year and plus commission, and, commission didn't kick in.
29K base right here.
Yeah. And
in
so,
Chicago.
Yeah. And
Yep.
commission didn't set in for a very long time. It was about a year at that point. So, there is now an instinct, just given how pervasive tech is in our environment, where the way to make money when we graduated college was you go into consulting, you go into investment banking. Now there's so much opportunity in the tech space, and so there's this assumption that you can finish school and get a really high salary, and that there's the work doesn't need to be demonstrated. And so I think the way to get you to a successful place is put in the work, talk to people, always be willing to learn, look for advice from people, and take that feedback to heart. I think the other last piece I would say is the mistakes are the things that are going to make you learn the most. I have learned the most from the hardest times throughout my career. And some managers, I'd say most managers, are not okay with mistakes. I always teach my team that the mistakes are the things that you are going to make you better recruiters or better HR people. Because if you're able to say, I made a mistake, and think critically about what you did differently versus trying to cover up that mistake so that you hope that no one else finds out about it, specifically your boss. If you look at those as opportunities for growth, then I think it's really going to set yourself up for success.
And for anybody sitting out there listening to you and inspired by your story of breaking into consulting and building their own business, what advice would you share to them, somebody who's recruiting today that wants to sort of follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I mentioned, this happened accidentally. I didn't have a business plan. Nothing was really scoped out. I think the biggest learning was that I really learned on the fly. I knew the mechanics of actually how to do the job, but the business piece was the element that I was learning sort of as I went. And so I think my ability to adapt and change with the changing markets, obviously saw a boom period, then global pandemic, and then another boom, and then another drop off a cliff. I think if you're willing to be resilient and you can withstand these difficult times, and be willing to adapt, whether it means new product offerings, new ways of getting paid, there are so many different elements that you can change, but remaining adaptable will be really crucial. Because if you had this plan that I developed in 2019, which frankly didn't exist, it would look very different. Than I had no ability to predict what was going to happen in the year beyond that, and 2 years beyond that. And so changing those plans and adapting and being able to change them moving forward, and knowing that they will change again, is the advice that I would give people.
And for anybody out there who wants to contact you and potentially learn more about the Brody Consulting Group, where can they find you?
Sure. They can find us at brodyconsulting.group. They can contact me at jessica@brodyconsulting.group. You can find me on LinkedIn. And look forward to hearing from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jessica. This was really cool, insightful, helpful, and we hope to have you back on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much both for having me, and congrats on your first episode. Very excited to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Take care.